Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for standing by. Welcome to the BIA Knowledge Leadership webinar. During the presentation, all participants will be in a listen-only mode. If you would like to ask a question during the presentation, please use the chat feature located the lower left corner of your screen. If you need to reach an operator at any time, please press *0. As a reminder, this conference is being recorded Thursday, May 21st, 2015. I would like to now turn the conference over to Ms. Robin Thompson. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Wendy. Hi, everyone. All of us here at BIA are so glad to see you here for our May webinar, where our expert Diane Walker will be giving us some great information on governance initiatives. Before I introduce our speaker, I'd like to go over just a couple of things. As Wendy said, please send your questions through the chat window, and Diane will answer those at the end of our program today. Second, our curriculum for our Knowledge Leadership series is developed directly from the feedback that we get from you. As you exit today, you'll be prompted to answer a short survey, and we'd like to thank you in advance for your time in doing so that we can continue to improve and bring you quality education with respect to the functions of ESI management, governance, and discovery. BIA does not currently certify its webinars for CLE credit, but attendees will automatically be sent a certificate of attendance for use in self-reporting, CLE, CPE, CRM, IGP, and SEDS. Now to my very favorite part of today's program, and that's introducing our speaker. Our speaker today is Diane Walker. Diane is a certified records manager and a certified management consultant. Diane is a highly sought-after expert in the field of records and information management and governance, and has been an advisor to many companies across the nation on best policies, strategy, and practice. She has trained, mentored, and influenced the careers of many in our industry, including my own career. Diane was one of 6 judges chosen by ARMA International to participate in the prestigious Cobalt Award, which is given by ARMA International to companies exemplifying the best in records and information management and governance. It is our honor to have Diane Walker with us today. And Diane, with that, I turn the program over to you.
Well, thank you, Robin. It's always nice to be able to have the opportunity to speak with any organization you're working with. I really appreciate the opportunity. Before I get started on this, I need you guys to understand that the information that I will be giving in this particular presentation is information that I've gathered through my own personal research. It has nothing to do with any practices or policies or ways of doing business that we have here at Marathon Oil, which is my current employer. So I wanted to make sure we were clear on that. We're going to talk about what is information governance. Information governance is kind of I say new, it's been the new buzzword for about the last 4 years, but it truly is an overarching discipline that encompasses regulatory compliance, a little bit of risk management, a whole lot of records and information management, of course content management, data governance, that information security and privacy that we think about daily, and litigation readiness. I'm driving this machine. I hope I'm doing this right. Okay, so who is information governance? Well, this is a pretty good example of information governance and how so many different functions, business functions within an organization are connected. Of course, we have the legal and RIM, the IT, the core business. We have to have a steering committee. Top management support is critical. I think my most favorite piece of all is the change management around that. You really can't instill corporate governance without a lot of change. Business development, audit is critical. Finance and accounting, of course, risk management. They're all critical to the IG team or the IG processes that you put in place at your organization. And why does it make sense? Well, we need to keep only what we need to keep for as long as we need to keep it, and that's the bottom line. We need to add our improved security, visibility, and access to information so that we can run faster and jump higher. Courts expect information governance. The regulatory agencies have put a lot of regulatory sorry when I lose that word, but regulatory rules around it. So we're familiar with Starbucks and HIPAA and Graham-Leach and all of the different areas of regulatory that causes information governance to be a process within our organization. It's risk mitigation. Overall awareness of the IG program gives us a positive effect. And we tell the folks the sky is falling, but the positive effect it has on the bottom line is quantified. And honestly, it'll never get easier. There's a time to start, and that time to start is today. And the bottom one's probably my favorite, and the one that's been in the news a lot, Edward Snowden. That information left the organization, and it's caused quite the kerfuffle across the globe. So we're going to take a 10,000-foot view of information governance. What that means is we're going to go pretty fast through the key concepts of information governance. And with that, there's going to be, you folks that want to take fast notes around this, don't worry about it. We can get you the presentation, and it'll be in detail so that you don't have to worry about taking those notes. Okay, information risk and compliance. That's our first section of information governance. That's where we monitor the legal and regulatory landscape. We make sure that we know who our internal and external compliant requirement agencies are. We prepare that risk profile. We conduct that risk assessment. We develop risk and compliance metrics. We create that mitigation plan. We manage and risk the mitigation process, and we conduct a risk and compliance audit. And when I take you to the slide, you can take a look and see what those duties, tasks, and steps are around information risk and compliance. So it's important that we engage with our legal stakeholders. It's important that we know what laws we need to research and that we establish a review process. In our internal and external, we want to make sure that we investigate what are the other folks doing out there, what's the best industry practices. And then, of course, we always have to collaborate with our internal stakeholders. We have to make sure that we at least establish a baseline benchmarking so that we can go forward and measure our progress as we move forward in our maturity model. We have to prepare that risk profile. That means, again, that we have to have stakeholders sign off and make sure that we are definitely in tune with our top management and their considerations around the information management program. The risk assessment, don't want to go too much into that, but there is the list of items that go into a risk assessment. The compliance, we want to know what equals success. What are the non-compliance triggers? How are we going to present those metrics? And of course, again, we want to get sign off on those metrics to make sure that we are accomplishing a successful program. And then the mitigation plan, we need to make sure that we have a good cost-benefit analysis. All day long we can tell them there's risk, there's risk, there's risk. But that doesn't sell real well with top management. We want to make sure that we can show them the money and tell them how is it going to benefit our organizations. We're going to monitor the implementation of that plan, and then with that process we're going to provide those metrics. We're going to respond to the anomalies that come across, and then modify risk management program as it's needed. And then those audits. No program is good without a good audit process. The framework, the folks that will actually perform the audit, how are we going to handle the findings when they're negative, and then of course update that risk mitigation plan on those audit findings on an annual basis. The next piece is that strategic plan. So we have to align the resources to develop the plan. We have to analyze again our internal and external drivers and trends, and then develop the strategic plan. The slide that helps you understand the pieces to those puzzles are aligning resources to develop the strategic plan. Again, we have our executive sponsor. We know our stakeholders. We know what their roles and responsibilities are when we develop these strategic plans. We want to make sure we analyze those internal drivers to make sure that we incorporate the corporate culture, the risk tolerances, again, the cost benefit, and the constraints around those internal drivers. And then the external drivers, well, what are our technology needs? What do we currently have in place? What are the external dependencies that we need to look at? What's the political environment, the legal and regulatory environment? Again, the industry best practices. And then develop that strategic plan. Define those strategies based upon all that information we collected, prioritize, put those goals into place, identify the strategic initiatives, the critical factors, measure that for success, write the plan, and then of course get the signature and always update it along the way. Going into the IG framework, we're going to make sure that we conduct the due diligence to identify those standards and to guide the IG framework. We want to establish the enterprise policies and standards that we currently have in place, even the gap of those policies that we may not have in place. Of course, develop the authority, the roles, the responsibilities, the communications and training, and the auditing and enforcement mechanisms for that framework. Going deep dive into that framework, this is what it would look like. We're going to evaluate the external standards, guidelines, technical reports, best practices, and there's a lot of them out there. I know there's ARMA International, there's AIM, there are particular agencies that would, or professional organizations that would deal with your specific business. We're going to evaluate the internal policies. We've got, with every organization, there are a lot of policies together that need to be clarified and easy for folks to understand and to follow. We have to select the standards, the guidelines, the technical reports, the best practices that would apply to our organization, and document that selection process. It's very important to document where you're going when you develop something like this, because if this is ever brought before a judge in court, you know how you came up with your answer. And then establishing those IG policies and standards. There are ways to define the discrete policies and standards, such as privacy. How are you going to deal with that privacy? The levels of confidentiality that you have within your organization. Validate that against your organization roles and objectives. And then of course draft those policies and standards, review them with stakeholders, and then again get approval and sign off. We don't want to ever develop an IG framework or an IG program in a vacuum. We want to make sure that as many folks as reasonable are involved, that they buy into this process along the way instead of surprising them with a nice tightly wrapped package at the end. And then developing those roles and responsibilities, again, you have to assess the role requirements, find out who's best fit for those roles, make sure the stakeholders appoint the right people to be on the steering committee and to serve on the different focus groups that you'll need, and then assign that authority, roles, and responsibilities. I will also add, make sure that you roll over to the next column of being trained, make sure it's communicated, and make sure that you have the right audiences in the right areas and the right information communicated to everyone who's going to be involved. Finally, on the framework, excuse me, you're going to establish what's the auditing criteria, what are the metrics again you're going to measure, and then how are you going to establish the enforcement mechanisms. I know there's been situations in clients I've worked with where they've had seasonal people working with them for a long period of time, veteran employees who, whether it's intentional or not, violate the IG program over and over again. What are you going to do when they violate the program? How are you going to handle that enforcement? Establishing the IG program, well, we're going to establish the program, the scope. We're going to mandate that program be in place. We're going to report on the progress. We're going to make sure that the accountability is assigned. We're going to implement the IG program. We're going to manage that program, and this is what it's going to look like. So when we establish the scope and mandate the reporting, we again have to make sure our executive leadership is on board and that we have the primary, the secondary organizational structure. I like to map out the organization when I do this to say, what are our functions, who are our executives, who are I think we call it varsity team and junior varsity team in order to pull off this play that we're about to do with the game. Define the IG program, mandate and scope it out. Make sure that for this program that executives understand that there's going to be money involved with it, and we need to ensure that that funding is established. Make sure that our executives are engaged and we report to them on a routine basis, and then of course obtain executive management sign-off throughout all of these processes. And then the accountabilities, again, we've talked about roles and responsibilities throughout each each step in this program. You have to go back and check that box. Have we established the appropriate roles and responsibilities? Do we need to tweak that? Do we need to add, subtract? Do we have the right people? This is a constant check and balance that you do throughout this part of the program. And then develop that communication plan. I'm certified in change management. Change management is a critical factor. You're going to be creating a new program with a set of rules where people are already doing their jobs in the business that they're established. So we need to make sure that it's clear, it's simple, it's effective, that we communicate that throughout the implementation or throughout the development process so that no one's surprised. And training, there's probably 6 or 7 different levels of training you have to give with a program such as this. You want to make sure that's on your communication plan. And then monitor the adoption of the program. Are the folks that are involved adopting it? And if they're not, why not? Evaluate the effectiveness of the program, and make sure that you align those resources so that when those anomalies do pop up, that you're able to react to it and be flexible until you get it right. And of course, always report to management. You've probably heard that now on 7 different slides to report to management, but they're critical in the IG programs is to keep engaged. Business integration and oversight, well, what's your current state of business processes? One of the things that is the foundational element of an IG program is, of course, when you're talking about records, it's what records do we create in the ordinary course of business? Where do we put those records? What systems of records do we have? Are people keeping it on their shared drive? Is it in 5,500 shared SharePoint sites? Are they allowed to take their thumb drives? Who is the custodian of that information, and where do they keep the copies? People say that back when there was paper, we had a huge records management situation that was hard to manage. Well, I will argue in the electronic world, even with the tools and technologies we have in place, we are buried alive with information that is critical to our organization that we may not be able to access, or that's accessed by the wrong people. And wrapping your arms around that can be pretty tough. Make sure that you define the current state of technology. Do you have an enterprise content management system? What systems of records do you have in place? How current and up to date are they? Where can you combine? What about the access, all the security around that? And then align that IG framework with your business area requirements. It's okay to go out to the business. It's okay to ask them what keeps you up at night. What are your pain points? If you had a Christmas list today of what you could do to make your organization more efficient through information, how could we do that? And then guide those information decisions. It's going to look like this. Current state, we have to interview the business areas. I hear a lot of times that the business areas feel as though we survey them and survey them and survey them. So when you do interview those business areas, keep that information and trend that information, refresh it without overburdening the business along the way. Make sure that you review the current business environment, the cultures, the systems, the processes that we just talked about. Make sure that you identify the needs of the business instead of driving the business to the way that you want to do things. And then, of course, document that environment of the current state, and then when you get to utopia on the desired state, how is that going to look across the organization? That technology, of course, the stakeholders, the users, the security models, survey and interview the stakeholders and users to make sure that you know what tools are in place, and maybe, not maybe, you definitely will be able to retire some tools. Collect and analyze data, identify what those gaps are, and address those gaps through a responsible channel. That we usually do that through committees, through IT committees, and the discussion with having a business and IT and IG and legal and of course the other parties as necessary. And then align that framework with the business area requirements means what are the strategic goals of the enterprise? That's a core piece of information. And then take that and find out what's the strategic goals of the business areas. Sometimes they don't always align. And then collaborate with each business area to develop that IG framework to make sure that, again, they're on board. Make sure that they approve it, and make sure that, again, you adapt your change management process as required so that you don't drop any of those balls along the way. And then developing that ongoing participation process. Like an information governance process will not work unless everyone is participating. And how are you going to make sure that they remain on board with that approval process? And then implementing that participation and approval process and reporting to management is a critical factor to make sure that those decisions that are made are the right decisions and that you're not overlooking anything along the path. Aligning technology. How does technology affect the business? How is it used? What are the trends? What are the latest tools that are out there? And not just the cool tools, but where do they lay on the Gartner reports or the Forrester reports? Do your research. Evaluate the hardware and software and the data life cycle from the moment that that information is created to the moment of destruction and deletion. I can't tell you how many companies that I've worked for that still have backup tapes. The last one I spoke with had backup tapes down back to 1920. Well, information back to 1929. Backup tapes, of course, from the 70s, and then align that IG strategic plan with that framework, and make sure that you're in concert with the IT strategy and the operations. And this is how it looks. So we need an inventory of the assets that we have out there. We want to make sure that we understand the architecture of our systems and their strategic plan for moving forward. We want to make sure that folks that are using the technology have adopted it. What is our backup strategy? If this place is destroyed by fire tonight, what's our disaster recovery strategy? And by the way, the number one disaster or chance of a disaster with an organization is the disgruntled employee. What's the privacy strategy? Are you going to be mobile? I can't imagine a company these days doing business without being able to do it on their mobile device. And then review that information storage practices, the hard copies, the digitals, the microforms. And yes, people are still using microfilm. And yes, it's still an acceptable practice because of the durability of that microfilm. Now, finding the equipment to read it, you might have to go to your public library, but it's still a good way to keep information. Review the use of vendors and outsourcing. How can you maximize those resources that you have out there in developing this plan? There's the existing policies again pertaining to information governance, of course the confidentiality of information, and then what's the help desk strategy? How can you incorporate the help desk with facilitating your IG framework? The technology outsourcing strategies, it seems like I'm reading these over and over again to you, but it's important that you understand how are you going to disposition, how are you going to preserve, what are you going to archive, how long are you going to keep the archives that you have established. All of that should roll within your records retention schedule, of course your legal hold process, and the business need for maintaining that data. And then what are the technology trends in the market? You know, there's cloud computing now, there's social media. I think it's exciting from my point of view from when we first received that shiny new desktop computer. There may be people on this conference call that don't remember a time of that delivery of that computer on your desk. There was a lot of years that we had physical data or we had information that was knowledge transferred or available only if you had the paper documents. Those technology trends are changing. We now have different ways of accessing information, and with that it's a cool tool, but it also gives us a new challenge on the way we're going to secure that data and who's going to have access to that data. And then the general technology trends for IG implications. So when you have the new voicemail and the WAV files out there on your email, or you've got instant messaging, what's the governance around that? We want to make sure that the stakeholders are aware of those particular risks that are involved, and if that decision's made that those tools are to be used and the risk is less than the productivity, well, those decisions are made. We want to make sure that we review those technology trends specific to our markets. Make sure that if there's a content management system out there, and there are a lot out there, there's Documentum, there's OpenText, there's SharePoint. You know, how are you going to develop the governing of that on an enterprise basis? What standards are you going to use? In the e-discovery world, what are the tools? How are you going to store that information that's supposed to be secured? What about those new data formats we have coming out there new? Every few years we have a new format. If you've got a record that you need to keep for 75 years, how are you going to read that 75 years from now or produce that to the court if you have to between now and that 75th year? And then make sure you participate in the evaluation of IG-specific technologies. Again, make sure the stakeholders are well aware of where we're going with the IG framework so that there's no surprises. And then of course there's the procurement procedures, there's the IG requirements for that process, there's the IG requirements to the development process of the tools, IG requirements to system requirements, data migration, decommissioning. There's a lot of situations that I've been in where folks have either archived it, taken that system offline. They keep the data, but they're not able to access the data. And then make sure that the strategic plan is aligned. Make sure you know the goals of the IT department. Make sure you analyze those goals with them. make sure you collaborate. If you don't have your IT on board with your IG framework and the way you're going to align this throughout the enterprise, then you're definitely not going to succeed in implementing this plan. And then collaborate with them to make sure that you understand what legacy systems are still out there and how can you decommission in the ordinary course of business or through going back and reviewing those legacy systems. How are you going to decommission legacy systems and still staying in compliance with the rules that you have in place in your governance program? And then collaborate with IT again to assist anytime a system's upgraded or replaced, and make sure you remind them of what your IG goals are, and of course make sure that you're involved whenever they go out to buy one of those new cool tools so that it meets the requirements of your IG program. Okay, I see there's some questions. I want to go back and address those questions, and if you have any along the way, well then go ahead and send them over, and then I'll try to answer that. So can you comment on the risk related to attorney competence with e-discovery technology as contemplated by the California Bar and ABA Rules of Professional Conduct? I am not an attorney. I really can't comment on those risks. If there's someone who can comment on those risks or that want to provide that research, I guess, Robin, you would be the one that they would send that to. I wish I could answer that. The MER conference was going on this past week, and I didn't attend, and that's usually where I gather that information.
Mm-hmm.
It says, you've given us great information on government. What if my company leadership says we are too small for a governance initiative? Can a company be too small to establish governance?
And we've heard that before, Diane, from folks that we have talked with, is my company says we're too small. Is there such a thing?
Well, I think it's a matter of developing the information governance strategy from the very beginning with the executives. I think that no matter how big you are, and I actually had a small company for a very long time, I know that there's agreements that I signed with my clients to make sure that that information would remain confidential. So what processes and policies and procedures that I have in place, I mean, that's the very basics of information governance. And then if we did allow them to take laptops and the technologies and clients accessing the cloud applications that we had available, I think it's very important that information governance is in place no matter how small you are or how large you are. The difference is how robust does it need to be, and how detailed and how critical is the information that you have in-house. And I think we have a duty to provide the governance around that information for any client that you're doing business with. What are the top 3 things that I should do in order to establish governance for my company? Well, you know, I've got like my top 10 list, but you heard me say it over and over again. Make sure your executives are on board. Make sure you have executive sponsorship. There is no way that you'll be able to carry off the implementation of an IG plan unless you have the executive sponsorship, that you know you have the funding, and that you know, even if you start off with a small piece of it, that you know that they're going to have your back whenever those folks are saying, I'm too busy to manage my information, I just want to do my job. The second thing is I want to make sure that your information policy was developed, the guidelines, the procedures around that, and that you had the change communication out there so that it doesn't surprise anyone that you have an IG program in place. And then the third thing, if we have to limit it to 3, Robin, then it would be the methods that are used to create, preserve, retain, distribute, and track that information. You have to have an information integrity review. So those would be my top 3. If you gave me 12, I think I could go a little bit more into detail.
Let me ask a question. You know, Diane, there's been some discussion about corporate communities of practice that are involved in ESI management and discovery, and I know you work as an advisor and speaker for other organizations and think tanks on this topic. How important is governance in the process?
Oh, it's absolutely. I mean, you know, I'm involved with the Corporate E-Discovery Forum, and each time we get together twice a year, and then of course we have different committees that work together to try to help come up with a strategy for different areas of information governance. It's critical. I mean, when we go to the Corporate E-Discovery Forum, you know, we have the legal folks around the table. We have the judges that, you know, do the sniff test to see if we as corporations are doing the right thing or acceptable thing, I should say. We have our records management people around the table to say, how do we pull together our policies, our records retention schedules, all the procedures of managing the business records. We have the data security folks around the table who say, you know, records managers, is great that you want to manage that information, but if you don't set up the system in the beginning in a way or a manner that we can, there's nothing we can do about it. We also have major corporations who have a lot of money that they can allocate to this to demonstrate what are the cool tools that are out there, which ones worked, which ones don't work so well, which ones are very hard to implement, which ones are out of the box and, you know, the smaller companies can utilize. I can go on and on. You know, if you want to collaborate with how do you disposition data that you've had for a long period of time, or orphan data, or what we call dark data, big data. I mean, all of those things that every company is currently experiencing, you can actually come together with a community of practice and move forward in confidence with knowing what other companies are doing and work as a team.
Exactly, and I may open up a can of worms here, but I'm going to throw this out there. A major topic of debate I've seen over the last couple of years, and both of us have been in ARMA for a while and have watched our profession transition from paper to digital, where things are born electronically. I'm seeing a lot of talk, Diane, about IG versus RIM, or RIM migrating to IG, and I see that as two disciplines. Some folks even say that RIM's going away. What are your thoughts on this?
You know, it's funny that you mentioned that, Robin, because I was at the ARMA Spring Conference, Records and Information Management Conference, not too long ago. And, of course, I was sitting in one of the sessions, and there was a gentleman who emphatically stated that he didn't believe there was such a thing as records management or the records management profession. And I got to say, I was really taken back. At first, I kind of looked towards him and said, what? Is this a well-dressed homeless guy that's crashed the ARMA Spring Conference? You know, and then I pondered his statement. And while I don't agree with his overall statement that records management is not a profession, I began to see his point of reference. We have to understand that information governance is actually a subset of that mothership we know as corporate governance. While information governance is that ongoing process, it's sort of like a super discipline of those key concepts which morph records and information management from what we considered the traditional science into a program better known as information governance. I think that if you are a records manager who has a 2.0, I guess I could say a records manager 2.0, you've always had a 10,000-foot view of records and information. It was regardless of the media, and the protection and the access and security around those have always been top priority, but you know, not all records managers look at it from a 10,000-point view. While practicing records and information management is one of the essential fundamental building blocks for establishing the program, we have to remember that there are a lot of disciplines that we need in order to reach that utopia, and we could say formally known as records management for some folks. So it's records management, it's content management, it's data governance, it's security, it's data privacy, it's risk management. I'm going on and on. It's litigation readiness. You should have just given me 3. It's regulatory compliance. It's long-term digital preservation. It's business intelligence that we wrap real tight into a dose of change management so that we can have a holistic IG program. And I'll stop there.
Exactly, like going back to the communities of practice that actually function as governance that you touched on a little bit ago with your work with corporate e-discovery, which is corporate knowledge strategies now. Interesting. I'm going to roll 2 into 1. We've got a couple of questions to end our program with, and I'm going to roll one of the last questions into one. I remember reading an article by someone at a major energy company in Houston talking about how silver halide microfilm would last until the end of time. You were talking about, you probably know who I'm talking about, but for folks who have microfilm, is it hopeless? Do you suggest, is there a best practice associated with that? Because you mentioned microfilm, and you also mentioned that we should plan to recover data 75 years from now, which made me think of this article.
Exactly. Well, let me say, I'm going to really date myself and go back to the microfilm world when I was operating microfilm. The silver halide film, there's so many dependencies on whether or not it's going to last. Let's say back in those days you had to make sure that the chemicals were right, it was rinsed properly, you did the blue flame methylene test. You make sure that you store it in a cabinet that's climate controlled. Make sure that you don't have it interfiled with the blue diazo microfiche, because silver halide and diazo are big enemies. And I've actually picked up some silver film and noticed that there were some brown bubbles growing because of some mold or some pests that get into that microfilm. So yes, it has the potential, and the rules are that it can last 99 years. I think the reason they used 99 years at the time was that how they could foresee that by doing their tests. How do you make sure that your records are there 75 years from now? You have a robust IG program in place with a migration plan, so that if you're in, I'll use SAP, a lot of people use SAP, and you've got those general ledgers that you're required to keep for a long period of time, then when you archive those or you migrate those, that you always have a plan of action for how you're going to move it to the next system or take it to a format that you'll be able to read for the time period that you need to read it. And sometimes we forget that.
While you were talking, Diane, we got some great questions in. We still have a few minutes, and I appreciate your valuable time. One great question came in, said, IG inside the corporation has the benefit of seeing all the corporate data. How do we handle ESI that was collected, processed, and sent to law firms and vendors with regard to retention? Is this something companies are even looking at?
I would hope so. I think that it's important that when you sign those agreements for that information to go into a third party, whether that's a physical copy or electronic copy or a cloud or any other applications, is that you make sure that you agree to who's going to have access to it, what's the security around it, how long are they going to keep it? What are they going to do after there's no longer a need for that? Are they going to notify you? All of that needs to be considered before you forward that information out to a third-party service.
Mm-hmm. On that same point, should law firms ever be holding databases once a matter is closed?
You know, that's a tough question to answer, and I'm going to have to give the consultant answer, which it depends. I mean, if you've got ongoing asbestos cases and you use the same attorney for that process and you've got all these cases related to it, well, of course I would want them to keep it until there was no longer any kind of, I guess, threat of that type of information being brought up in court again. So it depends on that. Or if it's a one-time case of a slip and fall and it's been settled and you have a settlement agreement brought back to you, I think that's going to be what your corporate counsel determines, or the litigators in place, and of course what kind of relationship you have with your outside counsel.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Are there issues unique to ESI that is in your client's control but not in their possession or custody? For example, held on a third-party provider servers, whether that's cloud, outsourced applications, in your IG assessments?
Okay, so if I understand, are there any issues unique to ESI that I've given to us that's in your client's control? I guess, is this speaking
that's
specifically?
A service provider, yeah. I think that's a service provider who's, that's the discipline that's asking the question.
Okay, so I'm working with BIA, and I'm sending information pertaining to, well, I'm sending ESI information and putting it into your cloud system, and that you've got custody of that system. Again, that's going to be based on your contract, and I would audit that. There's many relationships that I've had with third-party companies that maintain that, and also our legal hold notices and all the security around that. We always engage IT and legal to make sure that we have the contract written correctly, that we have the audit in place, and that the technology meets the standards so that it can't be accessed by those folks outside that shouldn't be looking at it.
Understood.
And do I have any? Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Do I have any specific instructions for law firms? I don't like law firms. No, I'm just kidding. I have actually never worked in a law firm environment. I think that from a corporate standpoint, the information I'd have for, or the information for law firms is you guys are a business too. And just as if you were a consultant, as I've been in the past, you'd want to make sure that your information governance plan is covered so that you know what your business or your clients need, how long they need to access it, who has the rights to access it, how long you're going to keep it, and how you're going to organize it. I don't think it's any different than if you're an oil and gas firm or a consultant or a law firm. The science around information government remains the same.
Okay. Excellent. Well, I've shared your references page, Diane, and in the beginning of the bio, I neglected to mention that you were also part of the prestigious group who developed the questions around ARMA's new certification for information governance professionals, and these resources certainly help with that as well. I want to thank everyone who spent their time with us today for attending and hearing Diane to give us some tips about governance. Next month, we're going to be joined by Ignatius Grant, who's going to talk about the Internet of Things. So if you want to register for that webinar, you can refer to our website, www.biaprotect.com, at our education page. And Diane, again, it was a privilege to have you here today, and we so thank you for your valuable time and hope that you're planning to have an awesome and safe and relaxing Memorial Day with your kids and grandkids.
Back at you guys. Y'all enjoy your weekend.
Thank you all.